Laughter in an ER has a specific sound. There is the laughter of relief, when a patient who was critical stabilizes, when a code ends the right way, when the tension of a shift finally finds a pressure valve and releases through the nearest available opening. That laughter is bright and slightly too loud and smells like the exhale of something that was held for a long time. And then there is the other kind, the kind I heard at 11:40 on my Tuesday morning when the tray left my hands and the contents of Bay 6's medication setup landed on the linoleum floor of the Eastfield Regional ER. That laughter is different in the way that a blade is different from a tool, shaped for something specific. And that specific thing is not kindness. I had heard it before, in places where it came from people who were about to understand very quickly that they had misread the situation. The people in this ER were about to understand the same thing. They just didn't know it yet. My name is Kay Ostrowski. I have been a nurse here for 6 months, and the tray I dropped was the least interesting thing that happened in that building on Tuesday. Let me tell you what the most interesting thing was. I am 36 years old. I came to Eastfield Regional after 4 years of civilian nursing, and before that, a decade of something else that I have not found a clean way to enter into a hospital HR system, so I have not. The box that asks for prior employment experience lists the nursing jobs. The box does not know what to do with 8 years in the Marine Corps and 2 years in a role that required a security clearance to discuss, and I have found that the box not knowing is more useful than trying to explain it. I work the ER because the ER is the closest approximation the civilian hospital world has to a forward operating environment, high variables, compressed timelines, the constant management of incomplete information under conditions that do not pause to wait for you to feel ready. After Marja, I find the pace manageable. Eastfield Regional's ER runs 12 bays in a horseshoe configuration, with a nurse's station at the open end where you can see every bay without moving. The floor is the specific pale green linoleum that civilian hospitals use in spaces where aesthetic considerations have been subordinated to ease of cleaning. And the overhead lighting is the flat, bright kind that finds everything and flatters nothing. And the monitors run their chiming counterpoint from bay to bay, in a rhythm that I have learned to read the way I learned to read wind, not consciously, but as background information that surfaces into attention when something in it changes. The ER at this hour smells like antiseptic, and the particular staleness of recycled air, and beneath both of those the copper note that means someone in the bays has an open wound. I had cataloged all of this on my first shift and filed it, the way I file environments. Completely, without drama, because incomplete knowledge of an environment is a liability, and I had been taught that in conditions where the liability was lethal. To the ER staff at Eastfield, I was the new nurse who was competent but hard to read, quiet in a way that some people found odd, precise in a way that some people found unsettling, and free from the small social performances that grease the machinery of a unit that sees itself as a team. I did not find the team performances difficult. I simply did not need them. I had been on teams that required a different kind of trust to function, the kind built from shared exposure to conditions that strip away everything that isn't essential. And beside that kind of trust, the small social performances of a civilian ER felt like a language I was studying rather than speaking natively. I was working on it. 6 months in, I was still working on it. To me, the ER was a controlled problem set. A busy morning was a sequence to be managed, not a crisis to be survived. After Marja, everything was a controlled problem set. I had been a Marine Scout sniper for 8 years, the last 4 with the 1st Marine Division. I do not tell people this. It is not a secret I protect with any particular effort. I simply don't volunteer it. Because the civilian world's relationship with the word sniper is not the actual relationship. and the gap between the word as the civilian world hears it and the word as I lived it is large enough that explaining the gap costs more than the explanation returns. What I will say is this: a scout sniper is not only about distance and a trigger. It is about patience, about environmental reading, about the management of one's own physical responses under conditions of extreme duration and stress, about being the calmest thing in a given situation for as long as the situation requires. I had been doing that in an ER for 6 months. Nobody had noticed, because I had not given them a reason to notice. And then I dropped the tray. Room 3 had Mr. Leonard Pace, 81 years old, admitted for observation after a syncopal episode at home. He had the translucent skin of someone whose circulatory system was running on a reduced budget, and the specific fragility of a man who had been large once and had lost the structural mass that made largeness safe. I had been with him 3 times that morning. On my 4th check, I was carrying a medication tray. Nothing critical, a scheduled antiemetic and a blood pressure check kit, when Mr. Pace attempted to get out of the bed without calling for assistance, which patients do, and when he reached the side rail, his legs gave in the way that 81-year-old post-syncopal legs give when they have not been warned. I was 4 feet from the bed. I had already read the situation before his hand left the rail. The weight shift, the grip change, the specific quality of a person's center of gravity dropping without authorization. I had a tray in both hands. The tray went first. There was no version of this where the tray did not go first. And then I caught Mr. Pace with both hands, absorbed his weight at the forearm and shoulder with the specific technique of someone who has been trained in body mechanics under load, and got him back to the bed in one continuous motion, without impact and without incident. He was breathing. He was embarrassed. He was uninjured. The tray was on the floor. The medication cups were distributed across the linoleum in the pattern that physics produces when a tray is released mid-step. The blood pressure cuff had skidded under the bed. The ER heard the crash. The ER looked. The ER, from its vantage point of the nurse's station and the adjacent bays, saw a tray on the floor and a nurse who had just dropped it. The ER did not see the patient who was now safely in his bed because she had made a choice about what her hands were for. The laughter came from Bay 2, which is where Dr. Brendan Kowalski was conducting a teaching round with 3 medical students who had been following him since 8 a.m. and who had learned in that time to read his reactions and reflect them. He was 31 years old and 8 months into his chief residency, which is the age and tenure at which a certain kind of physician discovers that authority is available and develops a relationship with that discovery that will either mature into something useful or calcify into something that causes harm. I had assessed this about him in week 2 and had been navigating it since. He leaned out of Bay 2 with an expression that knew it had an audience. "Butterfingers," he said. His voice carried to the station, calibrated to carrying the specific brightness of a person who is performing for the medical students behind him and who has identified an easy laugh. That's why we have nurses check the equipment before the tray. 2 of the medical students made sounds. 1 didn't. I noted the one who didn't. I was kneeling on the linoleum, collecting the medication cups, my back to Bay 2. I said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. I had been in positions with less dignity than this floor and had maintained function, and I would maintain function here. I got the cuff from under the bed. I stood up. I completed the medication administration. I noted the event in Mr. Pace's chart. Patient attempted independent transfer, assisted by nurse. No injury. Patient returned to bed. Scheduled medications administered. Accurate. Complete. Time-stamped. I did not note the other thing. The chart did not have a field for it. At the nurse's station, I rebuilt the tray. It took 2 minutes. Nobody spoke to me while I did it, which was a courtesy that landed differently from a courtesy is supposed to land, because the silence was the silence of people who had watched something happen and were managing their own discomfort about having laughed, and that kind of silence is its own commentary. I accepted it. In Bay 4, propped up on the exam table with a wrapped laceration on his left forearm and the bored patience of a man who had been in waiting rooms longer than this and in worse conditions, was Corporal Eddie Tran, recently separated, 1st Marine Division, 24 years old, who had come into Eastfield's ER at 0900 with a table saw argument he had lost and who had been waiting since then with the specific equanimity of someone who does not find waiting difficult. I had done his intake. I had wrapped the laceration with the technique that I used for lacerations, which was not the technique taught in nursing school, because the technique I used was faster and left less bulk, and had been developed in conditions where both of those qualities mattered. He had watched my hands while I worked. He had not said anything. He had the eyes of someone who was filing information. He had not laughed. 30 minutes after the tray incident, the shift escalated in the way ER shifts escalate, not gradually, not with warning, but in the single moment when the radio at the ambulance bay produces a transmission that changes the temperature of the room. Mass casualty, vehicle versus median barrier at highway speed, multiple occupants. ETAs staggered. First unit 4 minutes out. Kowalski came alive the way chief residents come alive when the case complexity justifies their training, with a genuine competence that I had seen in him before, and that was real. Whatever else was also true about him. He began allocating bays and staff with the authority he did have and that I did not dispute. Ostrowski. He looked at me across the station. You're on triage. Work with Chen. Keep the non-criticals moving. Don't let the secondary bays clog. He moved on before I responded. That was the correct allocation. I was good at triage. I went to the ambulance bay. The first unit arrived at 11:58. The second at noon. The third 4 minutes after that. By 12:15 we had 7 patients across the bays in varying degrees of acute need, and the ER was running the specific controlled chaos of a unit that is trained for this, and is executing the training but is at the edge of its capacity and knows it. I was in the corridor between bays 3 and 5, tracking 2 patients simultaneously, when the 4th ambulance arrived with a patient who changed the calculus. He was in his late 30s. Ex-military by the tattoo on his right arm and the way he tolerated pain, with a blunt thoracic trauma from the steering column, and breathing that had changed quality between the scene and the bay in a way that the paramedics' handoff description did not fully account for. The attending on this bay was a second-year resident named Park, who was good and was currently stretched across 2 patients, and who took the handoff and began the assessment, and was 90 seconds in before the picture organized itself into something that required a decision that was not in the standard protocol tree. I was in the doorway of the bay. I was not assigned to this bay. I was reading the monitors from the doorway the way I read environments, as background information that surfaces when something changes. And something had changed. I am not Stone anymore, I thought. I am a triage nurse in a busy ER, and this bay belongs to Dr. Park, and I will note my observation and relay it, and that is my role. I noted it. I relayed to Park, who was managing 2 things, and received the observation and said he would get to it. I went back to my patients. 40 seconds later, Eddie Tran, still on the exam table in Bay 4 with his wrapped forearm, raised his voice above the ER noise in a way that was not loud, but that carried the specific projection of a person trained to communicate across distance in chaotic environments. which is the same training I had, deployed from a different position. "Stone," he said. One word, addressed to the bay doorway, to me, to the corridor. Not a question. The ER did not stop. It was too busy to stop. But in Bay 5, Dr. Park looked up. At the nurse's station, the charge nurse looked up. Kowalski, crossing the corridor with a chart, slowed. I was the only person in the corridor who did not look around for the source of the name. I was looking at the patient in the bay. I was looking at the monitor. I was making a calculation that took 1 second and produced one answer. And then I walked into the bay. I looked at Park. "Tension pneumo building on the right," I said. "You need a needle now. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular line, right side. I can do it, or you can do it." Park looked at the patient. He looked at me. He looked at the monitor, which was telling him the same thing I was telling him, and for which he now had the framing to read correctly. "Do it," he said. I am not stone anymore, but my hands remember being stone, and the hands do not forget the things they have done enough times in enough terrible places. And what they did next was not nursing school, and was not the civilian ER protocol, and was exactly correct. The needle found the second intercostal space on the right side of the chest. Mid-clavicular line, and the sound of air releasing under pressure is one of the most useful sounds I know, and it happened. And the monitor's conversation changed register, and the patient breathed in a new way that meant the old way was ending. Kowalski was in the doorway. He had been there for the last 30 seconds. His face was doing something I did not have time to assess. Park said, "Nice call." I said nothing. I secured the line. I gave Park the sequence for the next 5 minutes. He nodded, which was the correct response, and I left the bay and went back to my patients in the corridor. At 13:20, 3 Marines in Service Alphas came through the ambulance bay entrance and asked for the charge nurse. The charge nurse was Darlene Marsh, who had been running this ER for 11 years and who had a relationship with unexpected developments that was shaped by 11 years of unexpected developments, which is to say she received them without drama and managed them accordingly. She spoke to the Marines for approximately 90 seconds. Then she looked across the ER at me. I was completing a chart entry. I did not need to look up to know she was looking. She said my name. I came to the station. The senior Marine, a staff sergeant named Fowler, who carried the specific economy of a person whose job has never permitted waste, looked at me the way Eddie Tron had looked at me, the way the patient in Marja had looked at me, the way people look when they have specific knowledge of a specific person and are standing in front of that person, and the standing in front of contains the full weight of the specific knowledge. He said, "Corporal Ostrowski." Not nurse. Not miss. The rank I had held, and the name that had gone with it, in the form they had been paired in the places where the pairing mattered. Kowalski had followed the current of attention to the nurse's station the way authority figures follow currents of attention, which is to say, automatically, and he was at the edge of the station, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man recalibrating a situation he thought he had assessed. Fowler looked at him once. Then he looked back at me. He reached into the document case he was carrying and unfolded a single page and read from it in the flat, efficient register of a person delivering an official record. Corporal Catherine Ostrowski, United States Marine Corps Scout Sniper, 1st Marine Division 2012 through 2020. 3 combat deployments: Marja, Helmand Province; Sanjin, Helmand Province; Ramadi, Al Anbar Province. Confirmed engagements in support of unit operations, classified. Commendations: Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, Combat Action Ribbon, and a letter of commendation from the Commanding General. 1st Marine Division, for actions in Marja in 2010 that preserved the lives of 11 Marines during an operation that exceeded its projected timeline by 41 hours. He paused. He looked up. Her call sign was Stone. Her unit called her that because in 8 years of service, under conditions that caused other operators to lose function, she did not. He folded the page. He looked at Kowalski with the direct, non-aggressive attention of a man delivering information he is not interested in debating. She dropped a tray this morning to catch a patient who was falling. I understand the room found that funny. The ER was not entirely quiet. An ER is never entirely quiet. But the bays that were not in acute crisis had achieved the specific stillness of people who are managing their own reactions to something they have just heard. Kowalski said nothing. His face did the thing that faces do when the architecture of an assumption is removed without notice. Not crumbling, not dramatic, but a quality of stillness that is different from composure. The brightness he had deployed at 11:40 was not present. In its place was something that a 31-year-old chief resident with 8 months of authority had not yet developed the vocabulary for. Eddie Tran, still in Bay 4, was watching through the open bay door. He had the look of a man who has completed a task he set himself at 0900 and who is at peace with how it went. Fowler looked at me. He took one step back. The 2 Marines flanking him adjusted in the same motion, and the sound of it was 3 sets of service alphas settling into a new position. And then it was a salute. 3 of them. Simultaneously, the clean precision of people for whom this is a statement, not a performance. I returned it. My right arm up, the geometry exact, held for the count, then down. Fowler said, "Semper Fi." "Corporal, Semper Fi," I said. They left through the ambulance bay, and the ER watched them go. And then the ER was the ER again, bays to clear, charts to complete. The unfinished business of a mass casualty afternoon still working its way through the system. Mr. Pace, in Bay 3, was watching me from his bed. He was the only patient in a visible bay who had been present for the whole morning. For the tray, for the laughter, for the 40 seconds in the corridor, for the Marines. He was 81 years old and had the eyes of a man who has seen a great deal and has arrived at a settled relationship with what he has seen. "Thank you," he said, "for earlier." "Standard care, Mr. Pace," I said. "How are you feeling?" He smiled. "Better than I was," he said. I checked his monitor. I updated his chart. I went back to the station and found my place in the afternoon's patient queue and worked through it in the order it presented, bay by bay, the ER doing what level 1 ERs do, which is receive what the world sends and attempt to return it in better condition, one patient at a time. Kowalski passed the station at 1400. He stopped. He looked at me with the expression he was still working on. Still in the process of building something more accurate than what he'd had that morning. He didn't speak. I didn't make him. He moved on. I moved on. The tray was back in the medication room, restocked and ready, exactly where it was supposed to be. Stone, still, always.